Hi, everyone. My name is Kara Joseph. I am the Training Programs Manager here at Creative Manitoba. And a little bit about Creative Manitoba is our organization strengthens, represents, and connects Manitoba's arts and creative industries. Our entrepreneurship training and mentorship opportunities teach artists how to sustain themselves creatively and financially. We are dedicated to promoting the value of the arts. Creative Manitoba is also located on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. We acknowledge and pay respect to the ancestors and treaties made on these lands by considering all our cultures, traditions, and the histories of colonialism, dispossession, and resistance as we create and learn together today. We would also like to acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Pass it on to Janelle.
Hello, everyone. My name is Janelle Shaw, and I'm the Executive Director for Arts Accessibility Network Manitoba. So AANM is a regional not-for-profit arts organization dedicated to the full inclusion of artists and audiences with disabilities into all facets of the arts community. Our mandate is to support artists with disabilities in achieving individual artistic excellence, promote higher visibility of these artists across all disciplines, and promote policies and practices intended to make the arts more accessible to all Manitobans. So thank you all for joining us for our fourth installment of our creative accessibility workshops with Creative Manitoba. And I will pass it off to our wonderful workshop leader, Amy Amantea, who will introduce herself.
Awesome. Thanks, Janelle. I appreciate that. Thanks for the warm welcome. So my name is Amy Amantea, and I'm happy to be in a space with you all today. And maybe what I'll do is, since I've embedded a little bit about myself into my presentation, maybe Janelle, I can ask you just to bring up the slides and we'll go through them, and you'll learn a little bit about me in just a few slides. All right, and just so folks know, I'm going to be, since I'm using my screen reader to access my notes, I'm going to be asking Janelle to advance the slides. I encourage you to engage in the chat if you like, and Janelle will read out anything to me that is a question that's important in the moment. And then we'll have a break. I have my alarm set for approximately an hour, so we'll take a little 10-minute break at that time. Okay, we're going to just start with the very first slide, Janelle. So of course, this is a workshop on exploring creative access. It's an introduction to the concept of description and creative access, created for Arts Accessibility Network Manitoba, Creative Manitoba, June of 2022. So thanks all for joining. On the next slide is about my land acknowledgement. So this is a photo of the shores of British Columbia, Vancouver, where I live. And I want to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you all from the unceded lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Peoples. Where I am in particular is Squamish lands. And it's really important to me to acknowledge that, because these are shared territories between the three nations. But I personally am literally right on the Squamish lands. A little bit of history on unceded territories in British Columbia is that 95% of British Columbia is located on unceded traditional First Nations territory. And we use the word unceded because it means that First Nations people never ceded or legally signed away their land rights to the Crown or to Canada. So it's important for us to recognize and remember that. As an uninvited guest on these lands, I want to pay my respects to elders of the past, the present, and the future, and for all of those who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. This will always be First Nations land. And my role as an uninvited guest, as a settler on these lands, is to connect, is to engage with people who are caretakers of this land, to join in the work of being a caretaker of this land. And I hold that responsibility very dear. If you are attending or living in Canada, Turtle Island, I invite you to visit a website called native-land.ca. It's a great resource. You can get some really important information about lands that you may be settled on. My next slide is a bit about me. So I say my name is Amy Amantea. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white settler and I identify with blindness and dyslexia. So I'm a member of the neurodiverse community as well. I'm an artist and a content creator personally. I also work in Access and I have done for about 15 years. I do specialize in 2 areas of Access. One is the built environment. So I have a really strong understanding of like BC building code, best practices, and then where the gaps are. I have a little company that you won't find really anywhere because I'm really bad at social media and stuff, but I call it Access in Practice, because the truth is that there are practical things that are not considered around access in the built environment. And that's how that little company came about. I also focus a lot of my work in the arts because I am an artist, and that's really important to me. My philosophy around accessibility, I have a couple of things that I just like to share before I get into these presentations, which is I believe that access is a continuum. So anytime I do this work, anytime I talk to people about access, I don't expect folks to have an understanding of what access is. Now in this space, you may all be much more aware of access, but I really believe that because it's a continuum, we jump in on that continuum, knowing what we know in that moment, and then we commit to learning and doing and growing more around access. There's no finish line in the work of access. So there's no rush to make things from 0 to 100% accessible overnight. It's a bit of a process. There's a lot of community consultation and relationship building that needs to happen. And oftentimes people say to me things like, well, you know, I wrote my play and I had audio description and nobody came. And you have to look at whether you built a relationship with the blind community, because we don't just know that you exist. You're not just going to advertise it on your website and we're going to find you. You really have to be purposeful about building relationships. And so sometimes the process of building the relationship before providing the access is an important piece to that. And I refer to your accessibility muscle a lot. It's one of the things that I have several taglines and people are like, you should copyright that. So your accessibility muscle is like any other muscle. You go to the gym to work out your muscles. You go walking, you lift cans of soup in your home to work out these muscles. And if we can strengthen our accessibility muscle, we can make better allies out of all of us, because, you know, you'll go back into your home and you'll say, oh, geez, that's so not accessible. If I had, you know, somebody here who was blind, that would not work. Or if I had a wheelchair user invited into my home, that would not be accessible for them. So the work that we do, you know, when you're a person with lived experience, you don't get to go home at the end of the day and take off the hat. And what I keenly notice about folks who are TABs, temporarily able-bodied, and that's a loving term that we give all folks. You're not promised a healthy body free of injury or illness your entire lives. But the truth is that, you know, oftentimes when we do this work around access, and I would say maybe other equity seeking groups that are doing work around equality and, you know, oppression and anti-racism and those things that are really important, is if you're not part of the group of folks that are experiencing that, you learn the stuff in a session like today, and then you go home and you go, whew, I can not think about that for a while. You know, I can let it go. That was a busy day at work. I'll think about it tomorrow when I go back to work. I don't get to do that because this is my lived experience. And so every moment of my life is impacted by my experience, both positively and with some barriers. So I offer that in this space because this is how I build allyship, as I get folks to think about things even when they're not asked to think about things. And in this case, we're talking about access. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next slide, and I want to just start with a question for you all, and you can use the chat and that'll be read out, and or you can just open your mics and popcorn style in. That's okay for me in this session. But I wanted to know from folks, what is description and what genres of description might you know of or have experienced? So there's some brave folks out there who want to just pop in and try and do a quick and dirty definition or share the different types of genres they've experienced description in. I'll give space for a moment.
Janelle speaking. I would say I definitely know about image descriptions from your past workshops.
That's
And
right.
Caitlin says, I think of Twitter image descriptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. That's cool. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Janelle and Caitlin. Let's go on to the next slide. So description is designed for people who are blind and partially sighted. Description it's a narration that is used to provide information surrounding key visuals. Now, of course, you have to think about this in terms of the different mediums, right, that are available. So there's a film medium, a stage medium, like you all said, image descriptions, social medias, the diversity description that I did at the top, identifying who I was. There's all sorts of ways of utilizing description. And the narrations are typically placed if you're watching something on a television or a screen, or watching something on a stage. Anything that's dialogue, that's got dialogue included, the narrations are typically based during natural pauses in the audio. And sometimes, if it's absolutely necessary, you end up having to step on lines. We do our best to encourage that not to happen. But, you know, sometimes there's a moment like somebody pulls a gun in the middle of a sentence and you need to know that that happens, right? Because it's integral to following the line of the plot. So you have to make sure that you're thinking about, does my description serve the listener and serve the content? So those are the two, like your pillars. There's a third pillar that we'll talk about in just a moment, but those are, I want you to just sort of keep those in your brain and around all things description.
And Amy, we got one more in the chat.
Great.
Ksenia, so sorry if I mispronounced your name. She says, I think of descriptions as using words to express something not in words, like a visual.
Yes, yes. I think that's absolutely an appropriate way of looking at it. Thank you for that. You know, again, if we think about it within the context of television, which is often what people know of description from, is television and movies. So imagine that you're enjoying a television show or a movie. It could be a live, you know, but just imagine you're in a seat somewhere and you're enjoying a performance or a television. And it would be challenging to gain and complete the understanding of what is happening without those visuals. We live in a visual world and we often have very visual aesthetics and very visual storytelling. So you would most likely miss out on crucial information that is expressed visually throughout, you know, things like gestures or character actions or costumes or things like that, scenery, right? One of the things I like to say around description in general is, if an image says 1,000 words, trying to describe it can be very difficult, right? Because we receiving visual information and we process it faster than we even know that we're looking at it, right? We're getting lots of clues from things. So again, it's just something to tuck into the back of your mind. Okay, the next slide is just types of description. So I wanted to just acknowledge that sometimes we use the term audio description and sometimes we use the term description, live description, descriptive video, image description. These are all essentially the same things. I mean, audio description is actually a US term. And in Canada, for video and media, in Canada, we would call it described video. And that's a CRTC kind of thing that is complicated to explain, but just so that you're aware that there are some different terms out there, but it all essentially means the same thing. Integrated description, visual description, dance description, right? It's really all about opening up access to these different mediums. And there are some different skill sets around them. And we're going to talk in a moment about the traditional framework of description and how that differs from creative access. Okay, cool. All right. So the next slide is on the traditional framework of description. So I've just, you know, there's a whole framework and I've pulled out a couple of things because some of these things get to be really important. And some of these things are like, you know what? I don't need that. I don't want that. I'd like to change that. The conversation around description in the blind community is ever changing and ever growing, because description was created by a sighted person for a blind audience without really asking them what it is that they wanted. And so now that people are empowered to have a voice, you know, we're starting to express those things. So I'm just going to go through these rather quickly. So describe what you see without interpretation or personal comment. This is has been a basic of traditional framework of description. I would say that when we do creative access, we kind of throw that out the window to some extent. You want to write simply, clearly, and concisely, ensuring that description is easy to comprehend. It's easy to comprehend the first time you hear it. That's important, I think, in any description, right? If you're just going to start to use vocabulary that is like over the heads of the listeners, then you pull them out of the moment, right? So we want to think about evocative terms and verbs and things like that, but we also want to keep it in simple, plain language. And this is the next point, is to use language that is descriptive, accurate, and appropriate. I'm probably going to bring this example up further than I want to, but it's the example of, they walk across the street. Great. How many different ways can we describe a walk? A jaunt, a saunter, a sachet, briskly, right? So when we start to add in verbs and adjectives, it changes the relationship to the experience, right? So walk is kind of boring. So I would kind of encourage folks to never use walk. It's just like finding the right evocative terms that can express more than one idea in one word. That's how we keep things concise. Use complete sentences whenever possible, unless it's simply, unless you are simply identifying a character. So sometimes in our work, if it's a stage piece and you've got 9 characters, if you've got third party, this is all third party description. So what I call witness description, somebody describing the content, everyone, quite often, they have to remind me who's speaking because there's just too many voices to have to follow. So then you can say Dave, Felicity, Juliana, and that helps me keep track of the characters. Now, when we do creative access, we build some of that in because as artists, you have ultimate control over your content. You want to match your vocabulary with the show. Good description fits seamlessly into the content, right? And good description is good for everybody. So it's not just great for folks who are blind or partially sighted, especially in creative access. And I have some examples for you a little bit later. We'll start to see how good description can be beneficial for more than just one the user group it was designed for, we'll say. Avoiding technical terms unless absolutely necessary, or unless you have time to unpack what those are, right? Maybe your content is all about, I don't know, interior design, and you want to talk about damask fabric. Well, if nobody knows what that is, then you have to find time to integrate that in to your piece and or explain what that is. Okay. Again, working on expanding your vocabulary is important. This I knew I was going to say the walk thing too early, but this is where I really wanted to emphasize how many different ways that you can say something like walking. Avoid using terms like we see. That for some folks in the blind partially sighted community, it's quite triggering. You just keep reminding me that I don't see. So find creative ways of getting around what I'm looking at, what we're seeing. This happens all the time in online presentations where it's as you can see, and it becomes filler words and no, I don't see, and thanks for reminding me yet again that I don't. So again, some people are more triggered than others, but it's an offer for you to marinate on. Being aware of what's real and what's illusion is helpful in descriptions for the users and distinguishing those things. Again, keep in mind, this is the traditional framework of description. Therefore, you've hired a describer to describe a piece of film, a piece of theater. They're witnessing it and describing through their lens, okay? Describing at the same time that the action is happening is pretty important, especially for folks who are partially sighted who can see some of the action. And it's not always possible to do that, but we want to encourage that as much as humanly possible. Okay, the next slide is, I call this one context is everything, because this is like the third pillar of description and creative access. Context is everything. So what does that actually mean? It means that the framework isn't always right. It means that you can pick and choose it a little bit like a cafeteria menu. It means that the description that you are building into your piece needs to be relevant to your piece, serving the listener and serving the work and being contextual. So, you can never describe everything that you see or that you're experiencing, right? So we have to make choices as folks. What is the information we want to impart? And this is when we get into more of the creative access thing, because it's a bit of a mixture of what it is that you're witnessing, but also maybe some curatorial stuff, some fun facts. Think about things like a gallery walking tour, the kind of stuff that you get about the piece of art, which is not the description of the art. But if you were to integrate those things, we would talk about some of the things that are essential to know about what we're looking at, and then we would add in some of the like who the artist was and what year the piece was painted, and what genre. Is it a Renaissance piece? Those kinds of things become really interesting, and they're super interesting to blind and partially sighted folk, because imagine you're watching a dance piece. How many times, I'm going to get into dance again later, but how many times can you say they jump, they walk, they twist, they turn, they roll, before I'm like, you know what, this is so boring to me. I have no idea. I can't put those pieces together. But if you created a narrative, if you added some, let's say you're talking about a single move, a pirouette, perhaps, and you say, the pirouette, and then you unpack a little bit about what that is, and then you say, this is a ballet technique from whatever date, whatever. So you get control over adding some of that stuff. And sometimes that's more interesting than telling me every movement that's happening, every moment at every second. I call that the laundry list of things, right? It's just a grocery list of stuff. Okay, next slide is, what is creative access? So creative access is it's a fluid term, and it means different things to different people in different regions. The way I use creative access is around artists having the autonomy to create and build access into their pieces. Now, that could be with ASL interpretation. It could be with captions. I've seen some great shows where they build captions into the show itself. Of course, my lens is for folks who are blind and partially sighted, so that's what I'm going to focus on as my lived experience. But creative access is really this concept of taking control over the access piece. It's a great way to also experiment with different ways of performing description. Because again, if we were thinking about the very traditional way, it would be neutral voice. And some folks love neutral voice, especially if you're watching a TV show, because there's lots of other animated voices happening on a TV show. But some of us, if we're witnessing dance, if we're witnessing visual art, if we're witnessing other things that are, again, we'll experience my friend Erin Ball later, who's a circus artist. If we're witnessing a drag show, I don't want my description to come off like this, because that would not fit the content and it would be boring. So we use creative access to play around with that. It's important to experiment. This is how we grow in access, right? So I encourage that in the space. The next slide is, what is the benefit of creative access? So there are service providers that do excellent work. We have ASL interpreters with us today that are doing excellent work. There are describers that are classically trained that do excellent work, but there's not as many of them as there are content creators out in the world. And so, what I want to encourage in artists is to, a lot of artists say to me things like, well, I don't know how to do description. You don't really need to know how to do it. You don't have to be classically trained. You just have to have almost the guts to be able to jump in and try something. And you know what? We will fail forward. That is a realism, right? We make mistakes. I don't even think there's such a thing called perfect description, because the reality of it is that every person with sight loss has a different need. And so some folks will say to you, you don't need to describe color to me. I've never seen color. It's not important, but I like texture. And another person might say, well, I was partially sighted for, the first 12 years of my life. So color is really important to me. So it's trying to find a balance of all of the things that you can add into your creative access piece to try and suit as many listeners in the blind community as possible. And that gets to be challenging and it gets to be daunting, but if we use our accessibility muscle, we can fine tune these things. And once you do it a couple of times, you get the hang of it. And you get the hang of what rules you can break and what rules are a really good best practice piece. So yeah, so there being a shortage of service providers is a real thing. People are at capacity, and it's a real thing. And the other benefit of creative access is that you as an artist have the ultimate control over the work. So if you need to tweak some of the dialogue to put in integrated description, you likely can do that. You have the ability to know the content very intimately, whereas a witness describer, a third service provider, is going to come in and they're going to watch it a couple of times, and but if it's something that's really important to you as a creator, there's a different vibe that I get when you're describing to me as opposed to somebody who's witnessing it for the first or second time. So I ask you to think about that as content creators. And the idea of folks creating their own access means that everybody is thinking more about access. I often get asked things like, well, when do I start thinking about access? And here's another one of my taglines that should be copyrighted somewhere is, access begins with A. So we think about it at the very beginning, even when you're applying for your money and putting your budgets together. Let's think about, what it would cost to build an access. It certainly is much more cost effective if you are not patronizing a service provider, and that's not to discourage you from doing that, because if you have a show that lends itself absolutely to that type of access, and you have access to folks to do that work, that's fantastic. If you want to do some creative access, then you might want to build in a budget for folks like myself, right? Community members who can help guide you around this process. And knowing that just because a person lives with blindness doesn't make them an expert around description, right? It just makes them an expert around what they like. So, if you're looking for consultants, you want to find folks that have an understanding of the community, have an understanding of the framework, where to break the framework. Those pieces become really, really important. But, just budget from the beginning. Think about it from the beginning. If you're writing a script, think about integrated description, and we're going to talk a bit about that too. I'm going to start off though on the next slide with low vision friendly. So low vision friendly, it's possible that not all content needs to have full description. Low vision friendly is a technique that was developed by Vocal Eye Descriptive Art Society here in Vancouver, who I also work with and work for, and I have for many years. If you can imagine, so if you think about low vision friendly and what that means. A lot of folks are using the term low vision friendly. They don't all give Vocal Eye credit for where it came from, but it was kind of birthed out of this idea of people thinking that they could come to Vocal Eye and get description on demand. And it doesn't work that way because it's a very labor intensive process. To do witness description as a service provider, you got to go and see a show 3 or 4 times. You got to make notes. You got to rehearse those notes. You got to practice those notes so that you're not stepping on the lines of dialogue, right? It's a really involved process. And so, we would say to folks sometimes, well, does your show need to be audio described? And well, I don't know. What does that mean? So here's what it means. If you can imagine your content as a radio play, if you're just listening to it only, so this is from the perspective of somebody who's blind or partially sighted, can you follow 90% of it or more? And that's the key, 90% of it or more. So sometimes you'll listen, you'll close your eyes and you'll be in a rehearsal and you'll listen to people performing your play. It's also great if you can get a blind person to come in and do this. And you might discover that, oh, there's this one moment in the middle that everybody laughs and I don't know what's happening because it's a visual moment. But the rest of it is pretty easy to follow. There's 2 characters, so I don't have to think about, the back and forth of dialogue too much. There's only 2 players in the space. That becomes something that we would possibly count as low vision friendly. And it's kind of the low hanging fruit of what can be available with description. So on the next slide, I'm going to continue. If you've identified that your content is indeed, in your opinion, low vision friendly, then you can start to consider how to create some pre-show introductions. So this would be an audio file, but also a written text document that can be downloaded, because some folks like to listen to things, some folks like to read things, some folks like to do things in different ways, right? So access is also about options. I typically find that most people want to listen to it, but it is great to have a written version available. And this can be accessed on your personal website, for example, on the website of the theater company that might be producing your work or presenting your work. It can be available as a YouTube link that can be circulated to any guests that you know in advance are coming, but it's also great to have this available at the theater before your show starts. If you're going to do low vision friendly stuff and have audio notes, tell the community about it. We're not going to just happen upon it. You're going to want to reach out to maybe some other organizations that are in your local area that work with people who are blind and partially sighted, and let them know that this is happening. So if yes, and you can follow the content itself, roughly 90% of it or more, now you're going to create your pre-show introductions. So these are some things that I want you to think about, which is what the visual gaps are. So we just talked about that a little bit, like when somebody's laughing during the show, because blind folk want to feel included. We want to feel like we're a part of the moment, that we're part of what's happening in the space. What might you, okay, so the next slide, Janelle, if you can switch, is what might you include in pre-show introductions? I guess I want to ask you all first. Are there things that you think that are important to go into a pre-show introduction? I'll leave some space to see if anybody wants to offer anything.
While we wait for other people to answer, I think it would be good to give what the set looks like at the moment. Ksenia says costumes, set, how many actors, and maybe their descriptions.
Yeah, those are all.
Oh, sorry. Caitlin says, I've been to theater shows where the actors describe themselves.
Yes. Okay. You're getting the vibe of where I'm going here, which is great. So yeah, the next slide is just a couple of bullet points. And this is not the be all and end all list, but it's some of the things you want to think about, right? Which is character descriptions, set descriptions, costumes, plot summaries, especially in pre-show introductions. Because remember, in some pre-show introductions, it's because you have a describer and they're going to set up things like set, costumes, but they're not going to tell you the sight gags in advance because they're describing the show as it goes along, right? If we're thinking about low vision friendly, so plot summary becomes important in low vision friendly, and a setup of the visuals, what some of the sight gags might be. So I'm gonna play you in a moment a sample so that you can get a feel for what that's like. On the next slide is just a few things to consider. So be conscious of the language that you're using, as we talked about in the framework. This is where this becomes important. You want to be concise, you want to be evocative, you want to use as few words as possible to say as many things as possible, essentially. And you don't want to use language that is unfamiliar unless in your pre-show notes, pre-show introduction, you're going to unpack what that is. And that becomes really important with cultural content. So as a white person, I identified as a white person when I came into the space. If I'm going to see something like "De Kink in My Hair," which I recently saw here as a live stage production with description, they're using cultural terms that are relevant to the Black community, which is not something that it's not my lived experience, so I don't know what those mean. And so there was space to be able to say what the term was and relate what that term means. And that was really helpful. And it was really, what it did is I think it's a bit of an education piece that we offer in descriptions. Sometimes there are characters that identify with they, them pronouns, and many folk in the blind community are not invited into these conversations. We don't find ourselves having these conversations when they're being had. You have to be in the right spaces to have these conversations. So if you have a character that's identifying with they, them pronouns, and you have the space to be able to say why they, them pronouns are used, that can also be a piece of education and learning in the space. So, those are some things that we can keep in mind.
Amy?
Yeah.
We have a question.
Sure.
So Kesnia would like to ask, would you also recommend other information / facts from the program, or is it overly much for pre-show? Maybe they should be available elsewhere?
Okay, we're gonna talk a little bit about that in just a moment. So I would say that remember, context is everything. Context is everything. So if you've already got your pre-show introduction that's recorded and it's 12 minutes long, well, that's way too long. I can't hold that much information in my brain, right? To be able, because that's what you're asking us to do as a blind person that's coming in to see your show or your work, is to hold that information in my brain and remember it for when it comes up in the moment in the show. And your show may be an hour, maybe 40 minutes, and maybe 2 hours and 40 minutes. So you're asking us to hold space for that. So there's some techniques that we can employ that are actually just a part of my next note here. So again, it's really about making sure that what you're offering is contextual. Okay, that's really what you have to hang your hat on, so to speak. So you're going to want to also consider things like the dissemination of information. Keeping that in a linear format is going to be helpful. And so it's different for every piece. So I wish I could say costumes comes first, and then it's characters, and then it's this, and then it's this. It's contextual to your piece and how your piece is arranged. So if the most important thing, aesthetically for a sighted audience would be, they're sitting in their seats and they're looking at this set, then maybe you start with the set, or maybe you start with the summary and you move into the set. And again, when you're thinking of pre-show notes, it's not the same as description because you don't have the same amount of time. And 5 to 7 minutes is roughly around average. It sounds like it's a lot of time, but you're not going to have time to say, in the center of the stage is a bed, to the far left is a this, and then there's a window, and then there's a this, and at the backstage right there's a that, and on the backstage left there's a that, and on front stage it's too much information. So if this is, and the example I'm going to share to you is a bedroom, right? And so if you can just set up the vibe, right? It's a messy teenager's bedroom. Here's a couple of things that's in it, like the bed is unmade, the this, the that. Those kinds of things, it becomes less about all of the navigational pieces and more about the vibe that you're setting up. And that's some of the difference in creative access, because you really, instead you're asking me to remember what's backstage right, what's backstage left, what's, all of those pieces. And I can't build that map in my head that fast and keep it there and then experience your content. But if you tell me that this is a family kitchen, family dining room with all the fixins on the table, I don't need to necessarily know what all the fixins are. I can imagine what that is, right? So we want to consider things in a linear format. And then, as I just talked about, we want to share the vibe or set the tone. That can become really important because we often remember the tone more than we remember the words, right? We remember the vibe more than we remember the individual words. It's quite interesting. If you do any research around public speaking, something like, I had this statistic and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's like between 7 and 10% of the words that are actually spoken are retained. But you leave a space feeling like, I got something out of that, or I didn't get something out of that. Right? Like after this presentation, you're going to leave and you're not going to remember all the words that I said, but I hope what you remember is, there was lots of interesting stuff in there. I'm going to have to go back and revisit it, as opposed to it was boring, it was dry, I knew all that stuff already, right? Like that's the ultimate hope. So yeah, there's a real statistic around the types of the words, the number of words that are remembered, because the human brain just can't process all of that stuff. Unless you are a superhuman, and there are some out there that have like didactic memories and like really great memories. I'm not one of them, full transparency. So, and I just sort of preface this with the question that came through the chat, which is my recommendation would be to do your pre-show introductions roughly 5 to 7 minutes. I mean, if you had to stretch that just a little bit, you could, but again, it's about keeping things related to the context, not overwhelming the listener, because we're holding this stuff in our brains. And presenting it. This is why the linear format becomes helpful, because as humans, we get into these patterns, we get into these routines. And so if you ask me to remember 6 letters of the alphabet and that they're A, B, C, D, E, F, I can remember that easily. If you say X, P, A, O, right? You bounce around. It's harder for my brain to remember all of those pieces. So this is why the linear format can be really nice. And then again, the last thing you can play with, and this is, again, these are offers, friends, and creative description is about experimentation, is playing with that vocal delivery, how it is, who's speaking when, and you'll hear that in our upcoming example, which is, I believe, on the next slide, Janelle. So this is an example of some pre-show introductory notes. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, they're roughly about 7 minutes long. So I would invite you to have a listen to them and think about things that stood out to you, because I'm going to ask you about that when we come back. So Janelle, are you comfortable to play that?
Hello, this is a pre-show recording for Emily Shane's Losing It at the End of the World. This audio is geared towards providing access for blind and partially sighted audience members. Because of this audio contains spoilers about the show, so listen at your own peril. Losing It at the End of the World is a dark comedy about the world ending due to the culmination of environmental disasters and two teens who must deal with the consequences. The show takes place entirely in Sarah's bedroom as Ethan, Sarah, and Sarah's mom wait for the end of the world. Hours before midnight, Ethan pays Sarah a surprise visit by entering through her window. Ethan's motivations soon become clear. Before their lives, and everyone else's, end, Ethan hopes Sarah will do him the favor of deflowering him. The stakes are high, and everyone is running out of time for last chances. Of course, not everyone on Earth will die. Wealthy elites and political leaders will survive the destruction of the Earth by escaping on designated spaceships, along with 5 randomly chosen families, moments before the world ends. Losing It at the End of the World is a one-act show that runs approximately 50 minutes with no intermission. It will be performed at the Culch Theater on May 25th, 27th, 28th, June 1st, and June 4th. This show has 3 characters: Sarah,
Hey.
Sarah's mom, Miss Morris,
Hello.
and Sarah's childhood best friend, Ethan.
Hey,
Let's introduce you.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a teenage girl, late high school age. I'm in a comfy shirt and pants and my favorite toque. I'm an able-bodied white teenager.
Hello. I'm Mrs. Morris, the mother of Sarah. I'm a white woman about average height, a little bit taller than Sarah, and I am able-bodied and I'd say about standard size. I am dressed, ready to go, styled my hair perfectly into an updo, and I have on one of my nicest outfits, which has, of course, been ironed meticulously.
hi, I'm Ethan, Sarah's best friend. I have asthma and I use an inhaler throughout the show. I'm tall, skinny, pimply-faced, and Filipino. I'm just to impress, and I'm wearing my good jeans and a nice button-down t-shirt. You know, like the formal attire for a teenage boy, and I'm able-bodied.
So, the show takes place entirely in my bedroom. I've only ever lived in this house, which is right next to Ethan's, so we've been best friends since I can remember. My bedroom is a relatively normal teenage bedroom. I have a bed and a nightstand on the right side of the stage, and the door to my room on the left side of the stage. The door is just a frame of a door hanging from the ceiling. The set of my bedroom is minimalist and designed with garbage throughout. It's still just a messy teenager's bedroom. Next to my bed is a wooden block that represents the window in my bedroom. This is the window that Ethan enters through at the beginning of the play. He often does this to avoid running into my mom, because my mom always manages to come into my room at the worst times. Literally, she always comes in and catches Ethan and me in some very embarrassing moments. There's also a closet in my room, about center stage, made from cardboard and a curtain, that Ethan hides in a couple times throughout the show. I also change clothes in the closet later on after my mom enters to see me in my underwear. One of those embarrassing moments I mentioned earlier. Anyways, when we use the closet, it may sound like this. The world ends at midnight, and of course my mom is worried about what I look like. Anyways, at the top of the play, I'm sitting by my bed with my mom, and she's brushing my hair while she chatters to someone on the phone. She's brushing way too hard, and it's annoying. Once my mom finally leaves to take yet another call from another crying acquaintance, Ethan arrives.
I enter through the window, which is hard on my lungs. Speaking of window, there's this moment where Sarah and I hide from people who are on the front lawn looking up at us, and we end up hiding underneath the bed covers and in the closet. Man, Sarah and I have a close relationship. She's my best friend, which is probably why it gets pretty awkward when I ask her to have sex. Yeah, there's plenty of awkward and embarrassing sexual moments between Sarah and me. I try to kiss her a few times and it always comes off as weird. It's probably my bad because I just have really awful timing. There's even one time where I think I'm about to spray mint spray into my mouth, to improve the kissing experience, and it turns out not to be mint spray. Speaking of awful timing, I later on unbuckle my pants, and Sarah's mom walks right in as I'm pulling them down. It's really embarrassing.
The embarrassment causes Ethan to retreat to my closet and hide in shame, which is, well, fair.
I am surprised but thrilled to see Ethan. He's basically like a son to me. I hug Ethan many times. Well, once he has his pants back on, of course.
My mom is a lot, so she sits both of us down on the bed, wedges herself in between us, and she gushes and sobs about how cute we used to be as kids.
It's so unfair.
Yeah, I know, Mom.
Being that it's the last night of the world, Sarah's feeling pretty down throughout the play. Sometimes I try to get her out of the funk by, well, telling her to get out of the funk. I try to dance, and when that doesn't work, I try to pick her up to help her dance.
But I'm not into it. I go limp.
Yeah, and we end up falling to the floor because of it. I'm not overly strong, so we tumble to the floor. Usually this would feel playful between the two of us, but right now it just feels like I can't get her to be happy.
Throughout, there's a game that Ethan and I play where we talk about what we're not going to miss. Near the end of the play, I talk about what I will miss, and I end it by saying that I will miss Ethan the most.
Then Sarah plants a kiss on me. It's gentle, sweet, amazing, and it feels right.
Yeah, we embrace and we both feel happy. I take Ethan by the hand and bring him to my bed, where we just cuddle together. Time passes, a lullaby is heard. Quietly and solemnly, my mom enters my room. I get up, but Ethan stays asleep. My mom says softly that it's time for us to go, and I decide not to wake Ethan up. I quietly grab my suitcase from under my bed before leaving the room. The final transition is the sound of the world ending. An ominous rumbling noise plays, and a flash of bright white light fills the stage.
End of play.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to these pre-show audio notes. We will also have this audio available to listen to on the evening of the show, either on your device, thank you QR codes, or on ours. Thank you for listening.
All right. Thanks for listening to that with me, friends. So I want to know what stood out for you all. We played this at a local festival, and as you heard at the top of these pre-show notes, because they were available on the website in advance of purchasing tickets, so folks could access those. Especially in a festival environment where you don't have the benefit or the privilege of, running for 4 weeks, right? You often get 3 or 4, or maybe 5 shows if you're lucky, right? So I want to know from folks what stood out. What stood out for you in these notes? Things you liked, things you didn't like. It's not going to work for everybody, but I'm curious what the thoughts are.
Okay, so we got Kesnia saying, I really enjoyed the actors introducing themselves in character and talking about my bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
Caitlin says, agreed. I like the diversity of voices. For me, one thing I really enjoyed was that they played sound clips of what you'll hear later on. So when you hear that, you can recall what it's supposed to be describing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the pre-show introduction was set up a little bit like its own little audiobook. And they say right at the top, in fitting with the show, that spoilers are going to be given out. So listen at your own peril, right? It's the end of the world. But the spoilers are actually important for us, because if the moment at the end where Sarah drags her suitcase out and leaves with her mom in silence, that means that we know that she's one of the elite chosen that's been picked to go to another planet. So her and her mom will live, but Ethan will not. And if you miss that moment, it's like, why did I go on this journey? Right? So, there's the balancing of the spoilers, but it's important because it's a visual moment. One of the other things that when we played this for 8 blind people who came to see this show, and talked about these notes, and the show in itself is mostly dialogue based. You get a chance to try and start to become familiar with the voices in the space. This artist also took time during the show to unpack some things with integrated description, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, where you are either identifying your character by name more often or saying things like, I think in the play, he sprays his mouth and he thinks it's Banaka, but it's perfume. And so he sprays and he goes, ah, perfume, ah, right? Which wasn't in the play, but they added that because otherwise we wouldn't know what was happening in that entire moment, right? It's a visual thing that it's a bottle of perfume, right? So they added a few of those things, but there were some things that the author thought were deal breakers for them. And those were these awkward moments, you right? Like somebody can lean in for a kiss and pull away, and one person can say, whoa, that, like, why did you try and kiss me? And then we know integrated with the integrated description what had just happened. But otherwise, it's this awkward moment where you're like, oh, and we don't know what's happened. So they've set up this vibe, right? They set up the vibe of the bedroom. They pointed out a few of the pieces that were integral to the movement, so that I only had to remember those few pieces. But they set up this vibe of the messy bedroom. We know that since the mother has a beautifully pressed outfit, even at the end of the world, what kind of human she is, right? That she's a meticulous human. We get little insights into the characters, which you wouldn't typically get, but as a blind audience, you kind of need those things to understand the relationships between these folks. And I also really love the sound effects that have been added, because I don't have to remember everything. What I know is that it's awkward, and that these two are trying to balance whether they're going to have sex or not on the last day on the earth.
And speaking of the sound clips, Caitlin also added, yes, the sound clips were great, and it helped me to know what to expect from the play.
Yes. And it's in a linear order, right? They talk about it also in what comes first in the play when, right? So they don't start with the moment at the end. They put it in a linear order, which is part and parcel to the idea. And they started with a brief synopsis of the play, and then introduced the characters. I had the characters introduce themselves. And this, typically pre-show introductions are all read by one person. But what a difference it makes as an artist when you have the time and the opportunity to make these creative decisions, what to do. And it was the artist that, when we were consulting on this, that said, whoa, could we like add in sound effects? And I said, sure. And then when I went to see the show, I could hear the bells, and I could hear the curtain rod, and I knew what it meant, what the lullaby meant, because those are silent moments. So I offer that as a really strong example of the kinds of ways you can open access if your show is low vision friendly, right? Okay, let's pass on to the next slide, which I think Janelle should be integrated description.
Amy, before we jump into that, we got about 1 minute until 1
break?
our time,
Okay.
or I think it's 11 yours. So maybe we could take a quick 10-minute break.
Sure, let's do that now. I think that's great. And then we'll come back with integrated description. So we're going to come back at 10 past, friends.
Yes, so feel free to get up, stretch your legs, get some water, go to the bathroom, and we'll see everyone in 10 minutes.
Sounds great.
All right, guys, so we got 1 more minute till we come back from our break. 1 more minute. Okay, Amy, we can get started back up. And just to remind you, we are on what is integrated description slide.
Awesome. I'm totally with you. Okay, I hope everybody enjoyed their little bio break. I enjoyed mine. Okay, I'm going to jump right back on in, friends, with integrated description. And this is just another technique of creative access that you can play with. This technique was developed by Accessible Media Inc., which is a national Canadian broadcast entity. And it was developed in all transparency. It was created for TV media, but it can also be adapted to stage stuff. And there's some really great qualities of integrated description. And the idea is that all of the pieces that need to be described are done so by whoever is on camera. Now, as in a TV medium, if you're doing an interview, if you remember things like documentaries where they have usually on the screen, it says the name of the person who's speaking and what their title is. And that never gets read out loud. So in integrated description, somebody would say, my name is Amy Amantea, and I'm the host of the show, you know, so that it's just there for everybody in addition to the print. It's also a bit of a narrative that can go through a piece, which gets to be helpful in terms of things like thinking about dance description and those kinds of pieces. And it's quite an involved process. It does ask you to think about, so if you're we're writing a script, for example, it asks you to think about things like it's a radio play. So you kind of have to think about things in a little bit of a different way, which is why I've added the website here for Accessible Media Inc., because they have a series of tutorial videos on how to create stuff. So here's one of the examples that I always use, which is if there's 2 characters in the show, one character may say, here, take this. And then you need the third party describer to say, she passes the umbrella, right? Or you could have your character say, here, take my umbrella. And the integrated description is built in. So it doesn't work for all content, because there are some scenes where people are sneaking around and lurking around, and you don't want to be like, oh, I'm chasing you and I've got a gun in my hand, or maybe you do, maybe your character is written that way, right? But it is something that you can play with in terms of if you're writing your own content, writing your own scenes, and your own scripts, that can be really helpful for an audience. And in some ways, adding in just enough integrated description means that you could have a low vision friendly show and fill in some of these gaps that you don't want, the secret that you don't want to get out. Somebody's, hunting somebody in a space or whatever, and it's all happening in silent moments. You can use your pre-show introduction to introduce that. So those are just some things that I wanted to offer in this space, and integrated description is its own several day workshop on its own, but I wanted you to all be aware that it exists, and the resource is here on the screen. It's ami.ca/IDV for integrated described video. And the videos are campy and silly and ridiculous, but they go through the different pieces of how you can do some integrated description if that's something that you wanted to play with. Okay, on the next slide, this is an example of another artist's experiment, and the artist is Erin Ball. Some of you may know Erin. Erin is, I'll introduce you to Erin. She's a circus artist, and she lives in Kingston, Ontario. She has a studio there called Kingston Circus Arts. And Erin and I are pandemic friends. We met during the pandemic, so we've never been in a physical space with each other, but have shared virtual spaces a ton of times. She's a double below the knee amputee, and she's an artist friend of mine. And I've been working with her over the pandemic on some of her audio description projects. And some of them are a lot of what Erin does is exploration in creative access. So Erin is always looking for how to expand access and how to make her performances more accessible for folks who are in the blind community. So she approached me with an offer of a consultation around a really unique project. What she said to me was, do you think that we can do description in lyrics of a song? And I thought, ooh, that's interesting. I don't know. Let's play with it. So I have a couple of examples here. I don't know that we'll play both of them because time is a thing, and these will not be included in the recording, just so you all know, because Erin is working on a larger project around this concept, and so is happy for me to share them sort of like on a one-time event, but they'll be edited out of the recording. So I think if it's okay with you, Janelle, if you go to slide number
The one with the video?
22. Yeah, 22. So let's play the when she's climbing video.
Okay, so that's not the red.
That's not the red, it's the
Okay.
next one. Yeah. If we have time, we'll come back and we'll play the other one, but I think this will give a good example. It's about 6 minutes long. It's a piece of her performance work, and I would like you again to think about the things that stood out, because I'm going to ask you about that afterwards. So if you can play when she's climbing, that'd be great.
This is not a story about overcoming or inspiration.
When we talked about this, had two things that we, I kept saying to Erin, when you think about circus arts, you don't think about folks that are using prosthetics or that have no legs, like she expresses. And so we think about what we know in terms of a visual inventory, things about what we have experienced before, if we happen to have had sight in our lives at some time, or things that people have told us about, for example, circus. And so I would say to Erin that we need a reminder every once in a while that this is the lens that you are experiencing this art form through. So same as if we had a wheelchair performer that was doing aerials, and there are some, they're fantastic. But when you hear about things like climbing up to the top of the silks, you tend to forget that there's a wheelchair there. Whereas visually, you're not forgetting at all that there's a wheelchair there. So this piece didn't necessarily have a dialogue narrative through it, but it's how we weaved access into this piece was about being able to tell a story, which means that I don't need to have every single moment of every movement described to me, because I can't possibly interpret what that means anyways. And so Bon Evans, who wrote the lyrics, well, we all did it together, but he's the musician, was experimenting with metaphor, referring to the silks as a set of railroad tracks that go up into the distance, talking about things that resonated, and not being hung up on describing every single moment of every single movement. So it really makes a nice piece both visually, but you can see how the creative access also supports the visuals, right? You almost don't even know that there is access built into this piece. So it's one of my favorite pieces to share with folks. And if we get time, I'll share the other piece with her, which is a hoop piece.
Amy?
Yeah.
So we got a comment from Caitlin about the video. So I'd just like to read it out quick, if that's okay.
Yeah.
She says, I'm sorry if this is the sidebar, but I'm an aerialist. And the line, sometimes people tell me to point my toes, hit hard. This whole video is amazing. Thank you for sharing. I've advocated for accessibility in aerial spaces locally, and it's been an uphill battle. Erin showed me what's possible.
That's awesome. You should connect with Erin, because Erin I just did this with her, a whole series of workshops on trying to create accessible spaces, because she was talking, and I'm not a circus artist or an aerial performist. So, but I understand that there's just like there would be in something like ballet, for example, you must do it this way, you must do it this way, you must do it this way, otherwise it's not perfect. And Erin is like, well, how do we, if you have a quadriplegic who wants to be a performer in circus arts, how do we how do we let the body do what the body does, as opposed to telling our bodies that they're wrong because they can't point their toes, right? So yeah, I would encourage you, Kingston Circus Arts, I left her website up there, and you can find all her socials and things, because she's really, she's a change maker in a lot of ways, and I think it's fantastic to be able to share her work. Okay, yeah, sorry.
She had a response.
Oh, great.
So Caitlin says, ooh, will do. Thanks for the tip. Yes,
you're-
unfortunately, there was so much of that restrictive standards, not necessarily for safety and not inclusive.
Like standards for aesthetics, right? And like who decides on aesthetics? This is also part of the beauty of creative access, and the stuff that I do in my work, the stuff that Erin does in her work is really about throwing that aesthetic out the window, because disability is not a bad thing. So if I want to use my cane on the stage, you know, some directors will say, oh, no, you can't because you're playing Juliet. And it's like, who cares? Right? Like, you know, let's be proud of the fact that we have representation on our stages, and on our screens and etc. So thank you for those comments. I'm going to whip through some of these slides because I realize where we are on time. So the next one is creative access and dance description. And I wanted to share this with you because dance is one of those things that often happens in silence with no dialogue. And as I pointed out earlier, this idea of they flip, they turn, they jump, they twist, they blah, 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 snoozity, snoozity, right? There's only so much of that you can listen to before the brain gets bored, even if you're a dance lover. So I often say to dancers, when they consider creative access, which is there a narrative that can be here? I mean, we ask audiences who are witnessing, observing, seeing dance to create a story in their mind about what's happening. But as a blind person, I don't get the privilege of doing that. So I need you to provide me with a narrative, or a series of metaphors, or some themes that happen. And there's some really great folks that I've been working with who've been experimenting with this in dance description. And so, you know, like there's a wheelchair dancer that I work with, and we often describe some of her movements as she twirls as if she's been caught in a whirlpool. Now, listen, there aren't many people that have been caught in a whirlpool, but it's a metaphor that is understandable by many people. You can get this idea of chaos, of fast twisting, fast movement, right? And if we're talking about her piece that she's been caught in a whirlpool as part of it, then what other pieces can we build in that are of themes of the ocean? Right? So it's, you know, can we add in other metaphors? Can we add in other evocative language around this idea of being in an ocean? The same could be, you know, there are some dancers that do great work and they dance out in parks and in park spaces and in natural spaces with the land. And it's like, okay, you know, instead of telling me that, you know, that they, I don't know, fall to their knees on the ground and sprawl out, it's like, okay, you know, they're connecting with the earth. Their fingers are dragging through the grass and they're connecting with the earth, right? It's this idea of adding in some of that subjectivity, which has often been poo-pooed on in the traditional framework of description. But as the artist, you get to add that. And as the artist, if you're the dancer and you're going to describe your own piece, you can say things like, in this moment, I could feel the drops of dew on my fingers. That is so evocative, and it's much more interesting to listen to than they drag their hand, they sprawl, they lift, they bend their knee, all of these pieces that don't quite make a puzzle piece, like a puzzle, come together. So I invite that in terms of what you can offer in terms of dance. So, you know, bring in your subjectivity. One of the describers that I have witnessed doing description of dance is a dancer, but wasn't performing this dance piece. And there was a movement, and she said, this actually reminds me of a game that we used to play with that my brother and I used to play, and then talked a little bit about the game. So I didn't know all of the movements that were happening in the moment of that dance, but there was a relationship piece as a human to this moment. And that was really interesting to listen to. And I was getting the vibe, I was getting the setup of what was happening. And so every single movement doesn't matter. When you're thinking about creative access, it's more about the vibe, what we're building, what we want you to experience, what we're trying to imprint on another person. And you as the artist know that better than anybody. So I encourage you to add that in. The next slide is creative access and visual art. And I put these back to back because they are related to each other. There's a couple of things in visual art that are really important to consider. So even though many of the same concepts apply, what we want to think about is, what is it that we're looking at? And that is about the medium. Is it a painting? Is it a sculpture? Is it a photograph? Is it abstract? Right? You want to set that up. Otherwise, we don't, as folks who are blind, have sort of an entry anchor point. You're going to want to describe the scale of something, but it's much easier to say, you know, it's about the length of my arm from my elbow, like from your elbow to your fingertips. And instead of saying, oh, it's 12 inches by 14 inches, or it's 180 centimeters by whatever, that's really hard to interpret in a person's brain. To try and do that math quickly, and it can take us out of the artistic experience. But when you relate scale to something, you know, like some people will say things like, well, it's about the size of a dinner plate, you know, like it's about the size of a postage stamp. Those things are relatively common experiences. Where you want to think about things is like, you know, you wouldn't necessarily want to say it's the size of an elephant. Because what does that mean to somebody who's never seen an elephant before? If you've had the privilege of being able to see an elephant on in person, of course, but like on National Geographic or something, you understand the scale. But many blind folk have only ever experienced like a small toy elephant or a stuffed elephant, and don't necessarily can't necessarily relate to the enormity of an elephant or a dinosaur, right? Those kinds of things. So what is equivalent to that? Maybe the size of a city bus. Just about everybody has experienced what that is, right? So it's about thinking about scale in terms of sort of everyday relatable experiences. And then you want to, of course, add some of the details of an image in there. It doesn't mean anything if you're going to describe a painting of a bicycle without telling me that there's a bicycle in there. But I don't necessarily want to be, I guess what I'm saying is it's boring when you're like, yes, it's a bicycle and it's got red streamers and you just go on to talk, it's got a black seat and it's got this and it's got that and there's a lemon in the background, and this is a painting that was described to me at one point. And it was just all of these sort of random things, and they like, I couldn't make an image in my mind that made any sense. But what became interesting was when you have a describer, and this happens often one-on-one in artwork, but sometimes in art tours, where you can say things like, you know, I had a bike just like this and my grandfather gave it to me and I was 6 years old and I fell and I scraped my knee. Like, that's the subjectivity that comes in. But again, remembering the context of the piece. So we're not inviting you to go off and share your whole life story around a piece of art. But when I know how my describer relates to it, then I have something that I can think about how I relate to it. And it's an invitation to a blind and partially sighted audience to make that relatable connection, as opposed to just, this is a painting with 9 things in it and these are the 9 things. Okay, so I encourage folks to play with subjectivity, how things make you feel in a moment, what you're experiencing in a moment. As a describer, I trust, and as a sighted person, I trust your understanding of body language. So oftentimes, you know, the traditional framework of description would say, if I hold my fingers up in a V, you know, Amy holds her fingers in a V, with her index finger and her middle finger, and like, it's a very complicated thing to describe, but it's a peace symbol, right? And that's a really well-known form of body language. So why would you describe to me the shape of it? Why wouldn't you just say she flashes the peace sign, right? This is the same as in some description where they would say something like, you know, I'm a character and they look left, they look right, they look up, they look down, and just tell me they're confused. The sighted person understands body language. It's a different form of communication. But if you're going to ask me in that moment to figure out what that character is thinking or feeling, I am so hung up on that moment that I can't move forward. So that's where I invite, and it's not part of the traditional framework, but many of us in the blind community, because there's roughly 90% of us that I identify with partial sight as opposed to total blindness, have some sort of visual memory, have some partial sight. And it's much more interesting to be able to not have to unpack those moments and to understand through the describer's lens what it is that they're witnessing. But the traditional framework would say, just describe what you see and let the blind person decide with themselves what it means. And that can be useful in some circumstances and not in others. I wanted to just share with you a little bit about the Vocal Eye Crowder. So Vocal Eye, I mentioned Descriptive Art Society here in Vancouver, where I am, does this thing called the Crowder. It's a crowdsourced description project. There's one happening right now, actually, in which every Monday we post a mural that's part of the Vancouver Mural Festival. And we ask folks, so please look up Vocal Eye on your social medias and get involved in this. It's super simple to do. And then we bring it back to the blind community. And it's a giant experiment around creative access. But folks are asked two things. What do you see? And how does it make you feel? And that's it. And you respond to the mural. What is it that you see? How is it that it makes you feel? And this idea of how it makes you feel, and even what you see, if I've got 10 people witnessing it at the same, witnessing the same piece of artwork, I'm going to get 10 different descriptions, because description is in and of itself subjective, even though we try and make it as objective as possible, because you bring everything you are as a human being into that moment of describing, all of your influences, all of your biases, all of your privilege, all of your experiences in the world. You bring all of that into that moment. And so two people will never describe the same thing twice. And so by having 10 2-minute descriptions, I can get a really interesting perspective of what a mural or a painting could be. The next slide is the Mona Lisa. And this was a part of a crowder that Vocal Eye did. And I wanted to do this exercise with you all. It's a 3-minute exercise. So I'm hoping that we'll have some folks that are interested in doing this. I want you to look at the Mona Lisa, and I want you to tell me what you see and tell me how it makes you feel. And I'm just going to give a couple of minutes of space. So I've budgeted 3 minutes for this. And then I'm going to let you, if you want to write it down, if you want to record it down, if you want to jot it, however you want to jot it. I'm hoping some folks will share. If you're not comfortable sharing, that's totally cool. I'll just share with you what my experience was when witnessing this type of description. So I'm going to just give you 3 minutes on my clock and go have a look at this image and talk about what you see and what it makes you feel, and then we'll come back and do some sharing in 3 minutes. We're coming back in 1 minute, friends. Okay. I'm hoping that was interesting to you. This is not an exercise in being a perfect describer, but I'm curious if anybody wants to share anything.
Okay, we got Kesnia who wrote, I think I did this one in the Crowder, but it took me a much longer time. So she says, a woman stares out at the viewer with a soft smile. Behind her, a road weaves through the trees into the distance under a soft sky. She looks as though she knows a secret that she might tell us or might just keep to herself.
Awesome.
Caitlin says, I see a painting of a white woman sitting in a relaxed pose with a dress and cape draped over her. She has a slight smile and long dark hair. I don't have the vocabulary to describe the art style, but there's lots of dark colors like gray and brown with blues in the background. Seeing this painting made me smile and feel happy because it reminds me of a song by Lonely Island, The Mona Lisa Sucks, I think it's called. It's a parody of the elite art world. It is a rapper who is joking about how overrated the so-called masterpiece is and how disappointed the singer was to see it.
Oh, I love that. I love it. I love it. I love it. Because what you're doing is you're integrating what it is you see with how it makes you feel, but also some subjectivity around the idea of this song, which is very interesting information and also provides us with some context about the piece, right? It's relevant to the piece because what you said is like, you know, the overratedness kind of this art form or this painting in and of itself, which is such an interesting thing. It's not what we would get in typical description, right? We would get all of the actual details of what's in there, and anything that you have to offer as a human being would not be considered of value. And I want to talk about the secret because I tell you, if you were the original writer of that in the original Crowder, and I'm guessing that you were, I use that example a ton of how we can add the most beautiful subjectivity. She looks at us as if she has a secret. Gosh, that is so evocative. It's so interesting. And, you know, you could, a smile is something that is so nuanced, right? And for folks who are blind, this is just a total tangent, but if you're born blind and somebody says smile for the camera, you get a big toothy fake grin because there isn't an understanding, a visual understanding of the body language and the nuances of a smile. So sometimes when we describe things like, you know, I don't know, the smile is slightly upturned in the corner, or, you know, when we try and describe just the look of it as opposed to the feel of it, that doesn't necessarily translate. So when you say something like, she looks at us as if she has a secret, I think to myself, oh, when I have a secret, I know what my face does. Okay, I kind of get that. So thank you for sharing those. I think that's it totally highlights this idea of creative access, this idea of kind of a hybrid approach, and taking the cafeteria menu of some of the traditional frameworks and just bending them a little bit. Okay, the next slide is just another couple of examples of things that can be done around creative access. And I didn't want to spend too much time on these things because the truth is that you can do these things in any which way you want to do them. So something like a touch tour, which could be things from a set or a costume, or like I say to Erin, if I was in a space with you, like, can I touch your prosthetics? Can I touch the silks before you get on them? Can I have a feel of what those are like before before you tell me about them? So touch tours are a super interesting way to open up creative access. You also, we encourage them to be done before a performance, but sometimes after is appropriate because while sometimes we're dealing with unions truly, and actors need to have their, they need to not be bothered, they need to be in their space, and somebody has to do the tour, right? So I offer touch tours as something to play with. And tactiles is another thing. Like, they're slightly different because I would think that with tactiles, you might be trying to replicate a feeling or an emotion through a tactile, a vibe through a tactile. So it's maybe not necessarily about experiencing, like, for example, what Erin's prostheses might feel like. but it might be more like, I don't know. So in one of the paintings that was described in the Crowder was the Starry Nights painting. And so if you had cotton balls there to say like the clouds, they look like they should feel like cotton balls, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, right? So there's this relationship building between a visual image and a texture. And it doesn't have to be exactly representative, right? But it's this idea of being able to play with the concept. Using sounds and smells can be really evocative. There's one particular show, I believe it was in England, that they were talking about, where they kept referring to sweetbread in the show. And the show was contextually related to a time during the Depression. And most people didn't know what sweetbread was because it came from, you know, the 30s, the Depression era. And so they had sweetbread made and commercially packaged and gave it to the blind audience members so that they could experience what it tasted like, what it smelled like, what it, you know, what I learned was that sweetbread really is just sugar on toast, truly. And at least it was at that time because, you know, there was scarcity, it was the Depression. But, you know, it was a really essential plot thing in this particular show. So you could invite sound and smell and taste into something that you want to do. I experienced with the Indian Summer Festival here with this South Asian festival that happens every year. So, you know, they invited a group of blind folks in before the pandemic, and, you know, like there were samosas and traditional foods that maybe you wouldn't experience, but because you're listening to somebody play a traditional instrument and in an environment with traditional fabrics, it's nice to have some traditional food, right? So it was something that was done specifically to enhance the experience of somebody who is blind and partially sighted. So I offer those in a space just for you to marinate, to think about. You know, if you have access to 3D printers, you can print out like landscapes of set pieces that you want people to experience, or layouts of a stage, as opposed to saying, you know, and upstage left and downstage right, this and that and that. They can feel where things are. So there's lots of ways of being able to play with this concept. My next slide is called Managing Expectations, and this is one of the most important things that you will need to do around creative access. Because most folks in the blind and partially sighted community know well the traditional framework, when you say, for example, you know, my show has description, that is what the expectation is, that I'm going to go in and I'm going to experience that. And there is a routine, a familiarity, a comfort in knowing what you're going to get before you get into an environment. So if you simply just say that this show is accessible for people who are blind and partially sighted, or that it's, you know, got description, you're setting up the listener to fail, essentially, because they're going to go in with an expectation of one thing and receive another thing, right? So we want to be very clear about what it is we're offering. So if you're going to offer low vision friendly, you're going to say to your audience, you know, this show is considered low vision friendly, and that means that 90% of it or more can be followed based on dialogue with the support of an audio pre-show introduction, which can be found here. Click on the link to get the audio notes, right? Then I know. You could also say things like, you know, when I talk to Erin, I say, like, tell folks that you're experimenting, you know, come see my show. We're experimenting with description built into musical lyrics. Okay, I'm going in with a different mindset about what I might experience. You're thinking about it differently, and instead of coming out feeling disappointed because it wasn't what you expected, you can come out feeling like, oh, that was interesting, I'd like to learn more, or I have some feedback that might enhance this for me, right? So those are some things that are really important around setting the expectations. And you can't really just say to folks, you know, this has creative access, because it means different things to different people. So if you're going to do it in your marketing, I would encourage you to be specific about what it is that you're offering. And if it's experimental, be specific about that. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, this piece is experimenting with description presented through narration, right? I mean, you could have a describer live describe for everybody to hear, not through the traditional headset. Erin's done this before as well, where they had somebody standing in a space describing what was happening with the performers, so everybody was hearing it, and it was kind of like the narrator of the piece. And it was beautiful because it had a little bit of everything. It had some description of movement. It had some description of who these individuals are as artists, some curatorial stuff, how things are being felt in the moment, and especially in circus, when you're thinking about like, how far silks or aerials may be off the ground, you're building in that suspense in your voice. Those things are all super interesting. We can get information from so many different avenues that if you just speak it in a neutral linear voice, it gets to be dry and boring, and the brain starts to think about, oh shoot, did I leave the oven on at home, right? Like all of that stuff. So I encourage you to set up the expectations appropriately for what you're doing. And then I encourage you to invite feedback. And there's lots of ways that you can invite feedback from an audience, whether it is a survey that's emailed afterwards, a SurveyMonkey. I mean, you want to make sure it's screen reader accessible. Usually SurveyMonkey is pretty good. Whether it's gathering folks over a drink afterwards to have a conversation with them about it, and setting up that this is a space, a safer space to be able to share things that you didn't like, right? Because it's just as valuable to learn about things that folks didn't like as it is to learn about things that they liked. We grow from what folks didn't like. And I don't, when I invite feedback around description, I don't say, what didn't you like? What did you like? I say, were there gaps in the information? Right? Were there moments that you didn't understand? What would have made it clearer for you in this moment? So that it's not just feedback is an art form all on its own. And oftentimes people will just say, oh, it was good. Oh, I liked it, or I enjoyed it, or it didn't work for me. And that doesn't give you any information to be able to grow and build and stretch your creative access practice. And providing access, as I said, right at the top of this, is also about building community. Right? So if we are not considering our listeners' experience, it can be a negative experience. And then we do the opposite of building a community. We send the message that we didn't really care about what it is. We just, we're ticking the access box. And we want to be very careful of that, because ticking the access box is not why we do access. We want to invite people into our art forms to experience what we're experiencing, to enjoy what we're experiencing. Those things are all really important. One of the things that Erin has done, which I invite you to do, depending on what, again, context is everything, what it is that you're trying to make accessible, is that, in certain environments, in Erin's studio, for example, in Kingston, she'll invite folks in from the blind community and say, hey, you want to sit on the aerial? You want to see what that feels like? Can I put your body in can I move your arm in the shape that my arm is in a certain position, so you feel that in your body? So there's all sorts of different ways of being able to translate that information. So again, it's an experiment. That's the beauty of creative access, is you're thinking about it creatively, what might work for the content, what might work for the listener, and keeping things contextual. I can't say those three things enough. Okay, I think that's the end of that particular slide. So the last couple of slides is where to start. And so I always like to leave folks with something in this kind of environment, because I think it's unfair to just talk to you for 2 hours and not give you any place to start. So a great place to start is reach out to the blind community. Ask about people who do this work in terms of consultation, knowing that not everybody who is blind is a consultant, right? Like, you want to find somebody that is interested in art, who is interested in the genre of art that you're doing, who understands like the framework of description and when to break it and why to break it and what works and what doesn't work and those kinds of things. So it's not just about finding somebody with lived experience. But this invitation to community consultants, whether it's with building in some kind of descriptive access or integrating ASL, reach out to those communities, right? If you want to do a whole show with plain language, you might want to reach out to neurodiverse communities. If you want to explore relaxed performances, you may want to reach out to those folks. I do all of those things, just saying, but it's about building community. So what becomes important is, for example, how positively I spoke about Erin in this space. Because I was a community member invited in to do this work, to be a part of this project, to share in the glory of it, to go through the challenges of it. I talk about it a lot in the blind community. And what does that do for Erin? It brings her into the blind community. And we actually shared some of Erin's work and her transition, her different experiments in description on our Vocal Eye platform that we do every Wednesday night, where we share accessible art for the blind community. And we have folks that join us from all over Turtle Island, from all over the United States, some folks that have joined us from Japan and New Zealand. Like, it's quite a wide-reaching digital platform that we're able to offer accessible arts. And that was about an experiment in circus art and description, right? So we set up the expectations, and it was really, really well received. So building community is super important.
Amy?
Yeah.
Isabel has a question. She wants to know, how much do you pay for consultants ballpark, and how can artists maybe access funding to do this kind of thing, might be the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, you know, things are going to be different in different geographical areas. Obviously, regionally, you know, the cost of living is different. What I like to say is, especially when if you're writing a grant, so Canada Council of the Arts, every province will have, like, we have BC Arts Council, so every province should have a provincial arts body. There's usually lots of funding for adding in access, but it's not, what I haven't come across a lot of is particular access funding. So it's about the project funding. You have to build it into the project. So I would say that you would want to, what I tell people is to ask for $75 an hour for consultation, to try to not pay anybody less than $50 an hour for consultation. So, you know, sometimes you can ask for it and you'll get it, and that's great. And funders need to know that this consultation is worth money. And then when it comes down to working with individuals, like for me, I have a sliding scale, because I know that sometimes I work with, you know, large civic arts organizations, and I can charge them $75 an hour. And sometimes I'm working with an individual artist, and I'm going to charge them $30 an hour. You can also point to things like the CADAC rate. You know, there's a half-day rate, which is, I think, $328, and a full-day rate. So if you're working on projects like that, you can consider the CADAC rates that are set up for Canadian artists. Yeah, I mean, it ends up being more about how much time, because you always think that, oh, 2 hours of consultation will be enough, and it never is, right? So it's really about, I would say that like, if I was, for me, consulting on the video with the lyrics, the description lyrics, there were 2 videos and we only shared the one, but for each of those videos, 6-minute videos, there was probably 10 to 12 hours of consultation, right? So you think that it should be simple. You just send me some notes and I say, oh, I'm confused here, I'm confused there, whatever. But it's not so simple. So you want to just make sure that you give yourself a bit of a buffer, I guess is what I'm saying. Because you may not get what you ask for. But again, if we don't ask for this stuff, if we don't tell our funders that we are in need of this funding, we lose it. So I would build it into every project, every single project. And access can be about consultation. It can be about providing transportation. It can be about providing food. It can, you know, there's all sorts of things that you can build into an access budget. And then it's like, oh, geez, you know, we realize that maybe, you know, this piece doesn't lend itself to this type of description, so I don't need this type of consultant. Instead, I'm going to, like, reduce the cost of my tickets for folks that have, you know, folks in the disability community, right? So again, you can kind of play around with some of those numbers.
And Amy, just to clarify something you said about the fees for consultations, you said CADAC. Do you mean CARFAC?
Sorry, I just did a CADAC report the other day where I had to update our numbers for an organization. Yes. Sorry, I did mean CARFAC. Thank you for that. Thank you. No problem. Okay, so that I hope that's helpful. And then of course there's also things that are just like honorarium based, and sometimes it's really just about what you're asking a person to come in and do. And sometimes it's less about consultation and more about feedback, and, you know, so there's various ways to pay for that, or to offer those things. And I would say that there are also different consultants that have different price points based on their experience. So for me, I don't do any of this because I'm being paid to do it. It's not my motivation, although I do have rent to pay and I do have to put food on my table, but I'm more about connecting with artists, connecting with my community. So I'm willing to work with folks within their budgets, but not everybody is, right? And, you know, the privilege of being able to have access to digital spaces is that I can consult with Erin in Kingston and we can hop on a Zoom, or I have, I'm doing consultations with folks in England and consultations with folks in India, because we're able to do that. And the barrier is the time zone, but you figure that out, right? You figure that out. So,
Amy, we are just about out of time, but we have one last question, if you don't mind.
Great. Yeah, my last slide is just a thank you. So yeah, questions are great.
So Isabel asks, how would you decide to do traditional description, creative description, or Crowder guidelines?
Okay, so the Crowder probably, I offered the Crowder so that you all can get involved in learning how to do some description. So it's not something that you would take on as a creative access project, but again, you have to think about the context of your piece. So if your piece is very visual based, then you may want to have a professional describer who's trained to come in and do that. And you can work with a describer and say, these are the things that are important for me to be able to impart in the description. And that could be like, my process in painting, because I'm an artist a painter who lives with disability. So I want to involve that in the description, right? So you can work with a describer to do that. Or as an artist, you can take that on yourself and write it. You can have other people read it. You can bounce it off of other people. You can say to other people, when you look at my piece of work, what do you experience? You can draw from that. So it's really about knowing what you want to impart to folks, knowing what your budget is if you have to pay a describer to do stuff, and knowing, understanding, I think, what it is you aim to do with your artwork. And I know that gets to be controversial in and of itself, because we've asked people to experience art and to make up their own minds. But it can be a little bit different for folks who are blind and partially sighted. So sometimes it's just nice to be fed the information, and to leave space to ask questions. If you're in a space, like a gallery space, and you have a group of blind folks, you can do your description, and I would keep it, 2 to 3 minutes kind of thing with your curatorial stuff, and say, are there questions? Because people might say, oh, you mentioned this thing, and that was really interesting. Can you go deeper into that? So building in the time to do those things. And again, that's not going to work for every project, because you may not have physical people in a physical space with a physical describer to ask questions of, right? It may be pre-recorded. So it's really just about knowing what medium and how you want to share and what you want to share. And this is where consultants can be really helpful.
Great. Well, I think we're officially out of time, Amy. This has been so wonderful, so informative, as always, so engaging. I always love listening to your workshops. They're just the best online, in my opinion.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I work hard.
And M. Lawrence says, I'll admit I tend to be shy when it comes to Zoom participation, but I can't thank you enough for this workshop. I've taken in so much and look forward to applying more creative access to my art and life.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can find me under Amy Amantea, and it's really spelled like a man drinking tea. It's the easiest way to remember it. And yeah, you can find me on social media, mostly Facebook. I'm not really anywhere else just yet, but also my email is amyamantea@hotmail.com. So if you have any questions, follow-ups, again, this is an introductory exploration, right? We could go way deeper, but I hope this gives you some information just to, what do they say, chew the cud, right? Just to think about how you can apply some of these things to your mediums.
Great, wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. Amy, I might ask you to hold on just a half second before everyone leaves, but yeah, thank you for joining us today. Kara, did you want to say anything before we sign off?
Not, and just echoing again, thank you, Amy. This was really informative and wonderful. I really enjoy taking your workshop, so thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
And of course, thank you to Tessa and Jordan, our wonderful ASL interpreters. Okay, everyone have a good day, and put your sunscreen on.
Right.
Tanya, I just want to say thanks, Janelle and Kara and Amy. Thank you so much. I always love hearing from you.
Thanks, Ksenia.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you. So it's waiting for one more participant to leave, and then I will get to business. Well, it seems like this. Okay, there we go.
Okay, perfect.